I've just had my introduction done for me, so I won't do that again. And I'm really sorry, but I'm going to have to read off this paper, which I've written it all out, every word, so I'll just be reading off. But there'll be a few questions, if you like, afterwards. Okay? So I'm going to be talking about my creative inspirations today. And I'll go through my career right from the beginning up until now and trace the development of my work by looking at the ideas behind it. And I've always been drawn to patterns. Some of my earliest memories involve looking really closely at patterns that I saw around me, which were things from my home, like my grandmother's crocheted blankets, dresses that my mum wore, picture books and table mats, wallpaper and that kind of thing. I've got this urge to organise things around me into logical patterns, and when I notice patterns in the natural world, such as the lines on snail shells or the formations and patterns found in leaves and plants, I get quite excited about them. I started out as a maker of tableware in 2004. It started off as a hobby for me, and I gradually became more and more obsessed with making ceramics until I gave up my work at Waterstones in order to make ceramics my career. In the early days, I wanted to make the kind of functional pottery that I love to have around my own home, and that was reminiscent in style of the folk pottery that my parents, my uncles and aunts and my grandparents had in their homes. My mum's family is from East Germany, and there was a very special regional look to a lot of the decor in their homes. For example, there is this Polish tableware called Bunzlau, which is earthenware and hand decorated with blue and white repeated circles and dots that I absolutely loved. I remember going to a shop in Hamburg when I was about 18 that was completely full from floor to ceiling of this pottery, and it was so exciting and inspiring to see it all together like that. It was so familiar from my family homes, but so different to the tableware that was around in England at the time. So my first collection echoed that quite strongly, which is the pictures that you can see right now. I've also always loved the mid-century look, and this aesthetic is one that I love to reference in my work. My grandparents' flat in Wiesbaden was beautifully decorated in the mid-century style. When I see photos of that flat now, it looks so fresh and contemporary, even though a lot of the photos of it were taken in the 1950s. You can clearly see how this look has come full circle in the last few years. So over the next few years, from about 2007, I developed more patterns and widened my colour range to add in more light and feminine colours, and combining the tiny hoops pattern with my new dandelions one. I still make these two patterns, and they're still really popular, and I enjoy trying out new colourways with those patterns. I was inspired to combine the two together on items such as plates and cake stands by a TV programme set in wartime London. I really loved the look of the clothes the female characters wore. There were a lot of twin sets and cardigans with contrasting borders that I loved, and I based my combination of colours and patterns on this kind of look, like reversing the colours and scale of patterns so that they all related to each other. And then in 2006, I started applying for big craft shows like this one, in Origin in London. And I didn't get into either the first time I applied, but I visited Origin to see what the exhibitors were doing that I wasn't, and I realised I would have to put more thought and intent behind my work in order to make it stronger. So I thought about what I'd like to do to develop my work. I thought that since I was inspired by memories of things from my childhood home and extended family homes in Germany, I could develop this theme. And so I worked on a new collection of patterns based on specific members of my family and named after them. I don't think we've got quite there yet. Each of these patterns is evocative of the person for me. For example, Johnny is my dad, and it was based on a stripy woven shirt he wore when I was about 4 that I remember studying close up when he picked me up. And Tordis is my godmother. She's from Denmark, and her house was a mid-century dream, so this pattern is a Nordic sunset kind of a motif. I think they're a bit further on. That's Krista, that one. That's my aunt. And that was plastic herb jars in her kitchen in Germany. That one's Elsa. That was my grandmother. She wore dresses and blouses with little small-scale patterns on them. And she also had a cup that was white with red and black circles on it. So this pattern was developed from these memories. I think I might have inherited my love of small repeating patterns from her. I carried on making new patterns over the next few years, whenever I had the time between making, with designs based on memories, such as Fox and Hens, which was inspired by the book Rosie's Walk by Pat Hutchins, one of my favourite childhood authors. I think it's coming up soon. You'll be able to see it when it comes, because it's quite... That's Johnny, that one. Let's go forward a little bit. That's Tortoise, and that's another Johnny one. There, that's Fox and Hens. Okay, and I adapted the Johnny pattern with a new one based on it, but made a bit less masculine, which is the dotted stripe pattern. I like to do this pattern in lots of different blue-green colourways with contrasting dots. So some are more wintry looking and some have a more warm, summery type feel. I also developed more complex plant-based patterns, which were inspired partly by a set of plastic herb jars in my Aunt Krista's kitchen, such as Melanie and Sorin. Well, they'll be coming up in a minute. I like to give my patterns names. They feel like they have more of a personality this way, and I always use names of people that I know. Melanie is one of my oldest friends. About 3 years ago or so, I found that I was stuck in a bit of a rut with being too busy making work for orders to do much creative thinking or developing. I was squeezing in new design work wherever I could, and the situation got more and more frustrating. I started feeling that I had to do something really radical to sort this out, as my business had snowballed out of my control. I felt more like a factory production line than an artist, and I wasn't really happy like that. So a friend of mine, who luckily for me is a creative mentor, suggested applying for a creative development grant from Arts Council England, which I was really pleased to be awarded in summer 2011. So this funding gave me the opportunity to make time for myself to step back and rethink what I was doing. This is what I've spent the last 2 years doing, and I'd like to talk about this now, as it has been very significant in terms of my development as an artist. There's one of the new ones. I started the development period in autumn 2011, feeling a bit out of my depth and worried that I wouldn't be able to do what I said to the Arts Council that I was planning to do, as it was going to take a massive change in my head from production pottery to a new approach. But I spent a few sessions with my creative mentor, which was a bit like counselling, and I gradually felt able to let go of the production potter mentality and allow myself to be a bit freer with the way I approached my work. This period of time has had quite a few highs and lows for me. I've been really pushing myself creatively, and at times it's been feeling very unsettling. It's occasionally felt a bit like an identity crisis, and I think this is to do with this change from production pottery to making one-off things that I think about a lot more. I kind of had to force myself out of my comfort zone to do this. But I think I'm gradually coming out of the other side of that now. I'll probably always have times like this, which unsettle me and make me feel unsure about the future, but I've realised recently that this is all as much a part of me developing creatively as the actual physical work I produce. Anyway, the first thing I made during this development period was some new platters. That's one of them there. I'd been wanting to make a new collection of large-scale one-off pieces, such as big, highly decorative platters, for some time, and I'd been thinking about what I could do, so I was really ready to do this. I also had a new source of inspiration, which was trees. I'd been looking at trees really closely and carefully ever since the early spring of 2011, when my family went on a winter holiday to Sherwood Forest near where we live. During that time when the branches are bare, so that you can see the structure and logic of the way trees grow and how their branches fit together in a pattern. But then in that really early springtime, there were hundreds of tiny, tightly closed buds on the branches in a very specific pattern as well. I really, really loved that, so I wanted to reproduce these observations on my own work. I made some illustrative pieces that focused on the patterns found in trees. I made some with single trees and some with a lot of smaller ones, arranged like a formal garden or arboretum on the surface of platters. I also did some designs on paper, which are now made into greetings cards. I did some drawings of trees and really simplified them down to the basics and made paper cuts from the designs, which I used as paper resist to transfer them onto ceramic. This is a technique that I'd already been using with some of my designs, such as dotted stripe. I also made some new tree shapes out of sponge for printing and used them, which is also a technique that I'd been using on my work for some time. This is how I make the dandelion and tiny hoops patterns. Then I finished the designs off with trailed underglaze and slip in tiny dots and lines. So the new trees collection was developed just with pushing these familiar techniques to a new level of complexity and detail. I was really excited and pleased with this new work, and have been developing new designs and work on this theme ever since. Meanwhile, I was doing a lot of thinking about what I wanted to do, how I wanted to develop more generally, and I started doing some still life studies in watercolour, as I'd been wanting to do some 2D work for a while. Since my ceramics are all about the surface pattern really, this was a logical step. I thought it was going to be lino cuts, as I discovered Robert Taverner, and through him the work of other 20th century artists such as John and Paul Nash and Eric Revilius. Also, as you can probably clearly see from my work, I absolutely love Angie Lewin and Mark Hurl's work, being contemporary printmakers whose work is very strongly rooted in this tradition of 20th century English art. But I got diverted into watercolours, as I'm much more confident with this medium. I'm hoping to go back to lino cuts sometime in the future. I paint watercolours every now and then between making ceramics, and every time I sit down to do some, as there is a bit of a gap between one painting session and the next, I can see how my painting changes and hasn't quite got there yet. It hasn't settled down to a place that I'm totally happy with. So I'm going to carry on until I have a settled style and technique that I'm happy with. Also, I've been thinking about what I want to communicate with my work. All my life, I've had an equal pull towards visual art and literature. I did an English literature degree and I worked at Waterstones for 10 years, so it's as big a part of me as the visual side. So I've been thinking about how I can combine these two things together in my work. Making work that tells a story or references narrative in some way is something that I'm very interested in exploring and would have more meaning to me than pure pattern design, although I won't stop doing this altogether. With this in mind, I made a few pieces that reference Edward Thomas poetry. He was a poet from around the early 20th century and died in World War I. He wrote many beautiful poems about the English countryside, focusing on the same kind of things that I like to look at in nature: weeds, clouds, seed heads, trees. I've made a few platters based on lines of his work, such as Out in the Dark and Thor. In the last year or so, I've occasionally collaborated with a local potter, Doug Fitch, who throws large jugs, which are much larger than I can do myself. I visit him and we do some throwing, and then I take away what he's made to decorate, and he decorates what I've made at his workshop. The most recent one is here on my stand and has a verse of a Thomas poem on it. The decoration is a direct illustration of the words of the poem. And the last thing I want to talk about, I get a little bit emotional about, so a recent sad family event has brought about a few changes in the way that I'm thinking about my work for the future. My godfather, who was my mum's older brother, died in March, and I've started thinking about a new, much more ambitious project that will hopefully develop a new approach and will pull together all of the creative themes that I've been working with over the last few years, and will be a big creative challenge for me. I really want to tell my uncle's story and commemorate his life, as he lived through such a momentous period of time, being a child when World War II broke out. He had a fairly typical experience of the war as a child in East Germany, and my granddad was a prisoner of war in Russia after the siege of Stalingrad. So my grandmother and her 3 children moved from East to West Germany and were refugees for a while. My uncle eventually built his own house in the west near Stuttgart, and he absolutely crammed it full of things that he collected: animal skeletons, collector's plates, coins, stamps, postcards from his hometown in East Germany, wooden figures, walnuts, just endless things. When I visited his house for the funeral in March, I saw everything from a new perspective, and it really struck me that he must have been collecting all of these things partly in order to hold on to his identity as a teenager originally from a completely different part of Germany, who had no choice but to leave his home very suddenly. Excuse me. So I'm planning to make a big series of large-scale jugs or vases, so it will look like a collection referencing his life as a collector, that will be decorated with paper-cut illustrations, each one being a scene from my uncle's life, like a sort of graphic biography in ceramic form. So it will be about my family history, but in narrative form, and will be highly decorative in the style that I've been working in recently, and will also reference the folk art from the area that my family is from. And that's it. So if you've got any questions, then you're very welcome. Thank you.